Welcome to ACOK Abridged, a show in which we analyze with excruciating detail, chapter by chapter, the Game of Thrones books. We are up to Theon 1, A Clash of Kings, which is the first ever Theon Greyjoy chapter. So we are, for the first time, entering the mind of the squid to find out what kind of cephalopod secrets lie inside Theon Greyjoy. And it's exciting because we haven't seen a lot of Theon Greyjoy so far. Mostly we've just had little mentions of Theon being in the background of a scene or doing one little thing or another. He's kicked a head, he's shot a wildling, but that's about as much as we got from Theon Greyjoy so far in the first book and at the start of the second book. So now we're gonna really plumb the depths of the psychology of this troubled young man. So we'll get into that in a sec. Housekeeping, I think we might rename this show. Currently, we're calling this ACOK Abridged because the second book of Game of Thrones is called A Clash of Kings. I think we might change it to just Game of Thrones Abridged, and we'll just continue the numbering system of the first bunch of the first book of episodes. So instead of calling this ACOK Abridged 12, we'll call this Game of Thrones Abridged episode 85. Does that make sense? Because we're just continuing all the chapters we did in number 1. So, benefit number 1 is that, people know what Game of Thrones Abridged is. Most people aren't familiar with ACOK. And it also means we get to hit the 100 episode mark at some point. So, that would be exciting. And it means if, God forbid, we actually manage to reach it to book 3, we'll be able to, just continue the numbering in the show instead of calling it a sauce abridged or something, Kelly says, I love ACOK Abridged. Me too. We'll still call it ACOK Abridged in the show. It's ACOK Abridged. I know it's ACOK Abridged, but I think at least as far as titles are concerned, we'll call it Game of Thrones Abridged. Does that make sense? Okay, that's boring though. We'll probably make that change, but we'll probably also upload the 80,000 old episodes, the original run, to the podcast. Hopefully. And by the way, this is a podcast, so you can there's a link in the description. You can subscribe to this as a podcast. You get the audio automatically on your phone, so you can. All right, whatever. We're talking about squids. Damn it. Oh, and yeah, it has been a while since an episode, but someone sent a nice email saying Dear Sir, here are 15 reasons why you should make another episode. And I was like, okay, I can't say no. So we're here, we're ACOK Abridging, let's begin. So, Theon Greyjoy. What do we know about Theon Greyjoy so far? He is lean and he is dark. We know that because I swear to God, every time George describes Theon in the first book of Game of Thrones, he calls him lean and dark. A lean, dark, handsome youth. Actually, no, not handsome. He doesn't actually call him handsome in book 1. But he's 19 years old, he's a teenager, and he's always laughing and joking, and he's often sniggering with derision. He's often laughing in a contemptuous fashion. Theon is snide, and he's cocky, and he wants to feel superior. And Jon Snow says he's an ass. He calls him an ass twice. Because the first time, the iconic opening scene of Game of Thrones when they execute the Night's Watch deserter Garrett. That bit when Ned Stark chops off the bloke's head. In the book, after the head is chopped off, Theon Greyjoy kicks the head. He has a little giggle and says, "Oh, that bloke's he's popped his clogs." He kicks the man's head, which is generally considered a faux pas. That's considered a bit gauche by most, I think. Kicking heads. So Theon's not a very likable guy, but we haven't really seen anything from his perspective. It's a little bit like Jaime Lannister. And especially insofar as like it's different to the show, because like in season 1 of the TV show, we do get a bit more humanization of Theon. Like we get to see his scenes with Roz, and there's a scene with Osha, and like there's a scene with Tyrion, and like Theon, we see a lot more of Theon early on, and we get to understand his feelings of like resentment and feeling a bit left out and whatever. We get to understand him better earlier on, and it's the same with Jaime in Game of Thrones season 1, like where Jaime talks with like Robert and Barristan about the war and about his trauma, and like and there's all the conversations with Cersei. Like we see a lot more of like Jaime and Theon's perspective in season 1. In book 1, Jaime's just an arsehole. Like we don't get any of like his perspective, let alone Cersei's. And it's only in the later books that they really start to be fleshed out and humanized, and that's true of Theon as well. So we don't know much about Theon apart from he's just this smiley, snide, sort of annoying teenager. He likes sex, he likes hunting, he's really enthusiastic about war. Like when Robb starts to become this battle leader and starts the war against the Lannisters, Theon is really keen to go out and kill Lannisters, and he says a dead enemy is a thing of beauty, and he's all fucking rah 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 because he's an insecure teenager who really wants to like prove himself. And he's a little bit of a cunt. And he uses a longbow. And yeah, I think that's about as much as we know about Theon Greyjoy. So let's find out more. Let's enter the squid. The first chapter of Theon 1: A Clash of Kings is there was no safe anchorage at Pike. And context. So Robb has started battling against the Lannisters, and Robb has sent Theon to go to the Iron Islands to make an alliance with the Greyjoys. Because Theon is, of course, the only surviving son of Balon Greyjoy, the leader of the House Greyjoy and the Iron Islands. And Theon was taken as a hostage, as a ward, to live with the Starks after Balon Greyjoy rebelled against King Robert back in the day, like however long ago, like 10 years ago. And so Theon is caught between two families, the Greyjoys and the Starks, but you know this. So there's no safe anchorage at Pike. Like Theon Greyjoy is coming back home to his old family home and his family, who he hasn't been here for 10 years, and it's not a very warm homecoming. It's not as welcoming as he would like it to be. And that is indicated right at the very beginning when we are told there is no safe anchorage at Pike. But nonetheless, Theon Greyjoy gets the ship that he's on to like take a sightseeing pass, like to sail past Pike just to see like what's up, just to have like a look-see on his old family home, even though he can't land there. The ship actually has to stop at like a different island. So he's being very indulgent here. Like the captain of this ship like shakes his head and curses the follies of highborn lordlings. Like Theon's doing kind of a stupid thing because it's dangerous to sail this ship up close to Pike where they can't land. He's forcing everyone on the ship to take like a giant detour just so he can like see. It's like if you're on like a bus, like a public bus full of like a few dozen people, and you're like, oh, by the way, can we just like stop by the Macca's? I want to pick up some nuggies. Like, I know it's not on the bus route, but like, I really want a McHappy meal. Can we just like swing by the McD's? And then like everyone else on the ship has to like take an hour out of their day because you want to like go and get a McNuggie. That is what Theon is doing to everyone on the ship. So he's being selfish and indulgent, and he's doing this. You know, I mean, he's doing it for understandable emotional reasons. Like, he wants to see his home. He wants to see his home approach. Just like he left his home 10 years ago. This is of huge, like, you know, sentimental importance to Theon, seeing his home again for the first time in a decade. It's understandable, but it's indulgent. Doing something for such a personal, emotional reason, when it's not necessarily like a very reasonable or strategical thing to do, which is the sort of stuff that Theon does. Like, later in this book, like, spoilers, when Theon captures the castle of Winterfell, that was, like, not a smart choice, as his sister Yara is very keen to point out to him. But Theon did it anyway because Winterfell has like huge personal, sentimental significance to Theon because it's the place of this family, the Starks, who never quite accepted him. So Theon is a very sentimental guy who does things for not always the most rational of reasons, I think, and that's often his downfall. So Theon is pulling up in the ship to arrive at Pike at the Iron Islands, and he immediately starts thinking about the day that he was taken away from home 10 years ago, and he can remember like every detail, like he stood at the rail, he was listening to the stroke of the oars and the pounding of the drum while he watched Pike dwindle in the distance. So Theon remembers like every detail of this event 10 years ago. He defines himself by this old grievance, I think. Like this thing that happened to him, being taken from his home 10 years ago. He is still so mad about that, and he feels like that totally defines who he is. It's that struggle between like being a Greyjoy and being a Stark, and feeling like he's not loved, and feeling like he doesn't have a family. That's Theon Greyjoy's whole deal. He stands and he looks for home. And Pike itself, the Iron Islands, are not the most welcoming place. The shore is all sharp rocks and glowering cliffs. I love it when cliffs glower. But it's all rock and it's all covered in bird shit and there's all green lichen up the walls. And once upon a time, it's like this point of land. It's like this cliff that protrudes out into the sea. That's like what Pike is. This giant rock that goes out, thrusts out like a sword. And it used to be that this was like a whole sword. It was like a big old chunk of rock, big pointy ass impressive bit of rock that pointed out into the ocean. But over time, as the waves hammered at it, eventually the land broke and shattered, and all that remains is 3 like separate islands. So it used to be like a whole piece of rock, but it's like broken up into like these pillars due to just the waves crashing at it for ages. And I think the wording here is kind of interesting. Like it talks about the waves hammering until the land breaks, which is very reminiscent of the descriptions of the Hammer of the Waters, which is in ancient times when the Children of the Forest brought down the Hammer of the Waters upon the neck and created like the swamp of the neck. And it's also similar to when they broke the Arm of Dawn. Like Westeros used to be connected to Essos, but the Children of the Forest broke the land bridge to prevent more of the First Men coming into Westeros, and they specifically use this wording of like the Hammer of the Waters, breaking and shattering the land. It's a lot of the same terminology, and so I think it's interesting that like that's used for the breaking of like Pike as well. Like if you wanted to get conspiratorial about it, you could theorize that hey, maybe the Children of the Forest had something to do with the state of the Iron Islands now. I don't think there's any evidence for that, but you could speculate. And I think the other possible meaning of like the Pike being broken like this is that it indicates like the broken strength of the Ironborn, because like as Theon is going to tell us, like the Ironborn used to be this proud, martial, angry Viking race that went out and conquered other places and took slaves and was raiding and reaving and raping, and they're no longer doing that because they've submitted to King Robert Baratheon and they've submitted to the Iron Throne. The Ironborn are still very proud of like this past power that they used to have. And I think the fact that Pike is physically like broken, it used to be a quote sword and it's now broken. So I suspect that might symbolize the broken strength of the Ironborn. Okay, so now that was page 1. We are on to page 2. So Pike is drear, dark, and forbidding, which, again, is not the homecoming that you want. Like, he isn't coming home to, like, you know, his mum baking him a pie and everyone's thrown a party for him. There's no, like, balloons at this homecoming. There's no beanbags, alright? This is a strict no beanbag zone, because this is just broken rocks and salt and spikes, and this is the way the Ironborn party. And it's not what Theon's expecting. and that's not what Theon hoped for. And so we get a description of like how the island of Pike is set up. Pike is, of course, like the main castle, like the main home base of the Greyjoys, and therefore like the capital of the Iron Islands, I suppose. And we have a description of all the different buildings, the Great Keep and the Kitchen Keep and the Bloody Keep, all of which are on their own island. I mean, the picture, if you're watching on YouTube, is good. Like, this is a whole bunch of, like, separate castles on separate islands, which, like, you know, architecturally, like, from like, an occupational health and safety perspective, is fucking ludicrous, because you got to cross these bridges to get from, like, one building to another. Like, if you want to get a, you know, glass of water in the night, you got to cross this, like, crazy-ass swaying rope, Indiana Jones rope bridge, if you just, like, want to go to the bathroom in the night, you know? Because all these buildings are separate across the ocean, as Balon Greyjoy learns to his detriment. But it's crazy, it's terribly unsafe, and like it describes how, you know, the sea tower, like the furthest out building on Pike, the one that's jutting out furthest into the ocean, the pillar that it's on is half eaten through by the endless battering of the waves. So the water is continuing to like degrade and break down Pike, and it seems terribly unsafe to me. Like this is like living on a nuclear bomb. This is like living in Megaton. Like this is living in a castle that could just fall down at any moment because its foundations are being battered by the waves. So yeah, the Ironborn live in this precarious, or the Greyjoys live in this very precarious, foolhardy situation. And Theon looks at the flags above the castle. He looks at the golden kraken of House Greyjoy on the flag, writhing and reaching against a black field. And Theon thinks that at least here, the direwolf of Stark does not fly above, casting its shadow on the Greyjoy kraken. So that's how Theon has felt like for the last 10 years of his life. He's felt like living at Winterfell, being a hostage of the Starks. He's felt like the direwolf has cast a shadow over his kraken identity. And now he's trying to come back to reclaim his kraken identity as a Greyjoy and to be the person who he believes he really is. He's never seen a more stirring sight, he says. And that red comet is in the background. So, like, at the start of this book, there's been that blazing red comet that everyone's interpreted differently. Pretty much everyone has interpreted this comet as some kind of magical prophetic sign that they are about to have, like, a really great time. That's what, like, Melisandre said about Stannis. That's what, like, Daenerys said. Like, that's what the Lannisters say. It's Lannister Crimson. Everyone's saying that this comet is good tidings for me, and Theon is no different. So Theon has a letter that Robb Stark gave to him, and Theon thinks that it's paper as good as a crown, because Theon is because Robb agreed that if Theon can get the Greyjoys to make an alliance with the Starks, King Robb is happy to let the Iron Islands become their own independent kingdom if they help fight the Lannisters. So that way, the Starks in the north will be independent, and the Greyjoys of the Iron Islands will be independent. And Theon figures that he will get to be the king of the Iron Islands, because Theon is the rightful heir of Balon Greyjoy, the current king, and Balon's getting on. And Balon does not have the greatest, like, self-preservation instincts, so Theon figures that he will inherit the throne of the Iron Islands after him. So he's not only going home to, like, reclaim his homeland, he's going home to claim a throne. He wants to be the king of the Iron Islands, which, as we soon learn, is not very realistic. So there's this woman, the captain's daughter, who comes and holds Theon's hand as they approach the castle. And the captain's daughter is on this, like, trading ship. The ship they're on is called the Mirrorham, and they're carrying wine and cloth and seed to trade for iron ore, because apparently, like, the main economic output of the Iron Islands is iron ore. And, you know, I'm no doctor of econometrics, but I suspect that, like, when your entire economy is pulling rocks out of the ground, like, that's a finite resource, no? Like, there's only so long you can do that before you need to start doing something else to make money. And I suspect that's part of why the Ironborn are so big on raiding and reaving and taking shit from other countries, is that they don't have much else to produce on their islands. All they can do is pull out rocks, which is not very Fun. So that's that. So the Iron Islands are reliant on trade to get like all these other materials. And so the captain of the ship, the father of this daughter, is unhappy about getting so close to Pike, because this is like a big fat trading ship. Like it's totally like not suited to like sailing nimbly around these rocks and stuff. But Theon has insisted on, because he wants to see his home castle. So again, he's being very indulgent and ridiculous in doing this, I think. All right, we're back. We had some kind of connection problem, but we're just gonna keep on rolling. Sorry about that. Technology sucks. All right, so we were talking about Theon Greyjoy on his ship, the Mirrorham. He's returning back to Pike. We had a connection problem, now we're back. Okay, so, Iron Islands, they make a lot of ore. Mirrorham is not very good for dodging around rocks. Theon's being a bit of an idiot with sailing in towards Pike, because this fat old trading ship is like not at all like it's not an Ironborn longboat. Like, it's not good at this sort of thing. But Theon's insisting on going by Pike anyway. The Mirrorham has to struggle mightily to keep itself off these rocks. Wouldn't it be funny if like Theon just died? Like, wouldn't it be funny if this ship just this ship just broke on the rocks of Pike because of Theon's dumbheaded insistence to like sail by Pike? That would be honestly probably better off for Theon rather than going through all the shit that he goes through. That's the thing about Theon. Like, Theon is a pretty obnoxious guy. Like, he's pretty dislikable in a lot of ways. But I don't think anyone would think that he deserves what happens to him later on when he becomes Reek, when he becomes abused by Ramsay. So it's sort of this weird thing of like, you know, Theon might not be super likable, but it's also hard not to feel sorry for him, at least later on. But yeah, I mean, I guess we'll get to that. And so Theon is hooking up with this girl, the captain's daughter, the daughter of the captain who's sailing the ship. And the captain's daughter says, "Man, that sure looks like a shitty house you got there, Theon." She's not loving the whole look of Pike. And Theon says, "Yeah, you know, the Iron Islands, it's windy and cold and damp. It's a miserable, hard place, but you know what? Hard places breed hard men, and hard men rule the world." And he talks about, like, the history of the Ironborn and how Ironborn captains are proud and willful, and for years they used to conquer over Westeros, and, you know, Ironborn never bend the knee, and it's tough men, and men make crowns, and it's all rah, 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 and Theon's going on about how tough Ironborn are, and, like, the implication being Theon thinks he's a big, tough Ironborn man as well. He wants to claim his crown. It's men who make crowns. Theon thinks he's this hard, tough guy. But of course, you know, he hasn't been here for 10 years. You know, Theon kind of isn't Ironborn in a lot of ways. Like, as we learn throughout this chapter, Theon has forgotten a lot of like what Ironborn culture is. He's and so like walking up here and thinking he can just like step right back into like what it means to be an Ironborn is ridiculous, as his family is about to tell him. So they talk about the history of the Ironborn, and Theon talks about, if we had an Ironborn longship, we could be sailing around these rocks like nothing else. We could be doing pirouettes and special moves for style points. Like, this would be like Tony Hawk Pro Skater 3, but in a longship. We'd be doing like ollies across the ocean around Pike. Around all these dangerous rocks, we'd be doing like kick flips. Be great. He's really excited about how great like Ironborn longships are, but of course they're in this fat old trader ship called the Mirrorham, which Theon describes as a wallowing tub, which is therefore not suited to bounce around the rocks. But Theon here, I think, is likening himself to an Ironborn longship. He's trying to relate himself to the hard, tough Ironborn thing. But I think the truth is, Theon, is that Theon is more of a wallowing tub than he is a longship. Theon is not suited to this hard place. He is not this tough guy. He is this, like, rich, fancy, fat fella who's been, like, chilling in a castle for 10 years, dressed up in all these nice doublets. Like, Theon is more wallowing tub than longship. in my opinion. And so Theon puts his arm around the captain's daughter and tells the captain, "We'll be below in my cabin." So Theon is he's put his arm around this guy's daughter and he said, "Hey, I'm just gonna pop downstairs to fuck your daughter." And to add insult to insult, he's doing it in the captain's cabin. Like Theon thinks that, you know, the cabin was originally the captain's, but since Theon is highborn, he just like took over this guy's room. So Theon just waltzed onto the Mirrorham, took the captain's cabin, took the captain's daughter, and now he's telling the captain to his face, "Hey, I'm just going to take your daughter downstairs for an old ironborn hump," which is an incredibly obnoxious thing to do. I mean, it's one thing to do that, but it's another thing to specifically enjoy the captain's discomfort. Theon says that it's amusing watching the captain struggle to swallow his outrage. So Theon not only like is being incredibly rude and obnoxious, he is enjoying making the captain feel uncomfortable. So that's, I think, Theon's most like dislikable quality, is that he's constantly like belittling people and like trying to make himself feel superior by making other people suffer to some extent. And so that's pretty horrible. And Theon, so Theon has sex with the captain's daughter. And he describes her... It's a bit like a food description, actually. Theon says that the girl is a shade plump for his taste, with skin as splotchy as oatmeal. So, that's a very food-based description of a body, isn't it? Plump, taste, and splotchy. I think George Martin is doing food descriptions even when he's doing human body descriptions. So Theon, you know, studies her in like a kind of dehumanizing way. Like he's kind of just describing, you know, just like the physicality of her body and saying that, oh, he finds her diverting. Like that's sort of all she is to him. And he undresses her and she asks about his history and he explains how he was 10 years old when he was taken to Winterfell. He feels like he was a hostage, but now his life is his own again. And Theon thinks that the captain's daughter is stupid, but Theon had never required a woman to be clever. So Theon, in his dalliances with women, he's not looking for someone who he likes or connects with or who challenges him or who is like an interesting person. Theon is looking for just like dumb people to have sex with. And I think part of that is Theon wanting to feel superior. Theon wants to feel unchallenged. Theon wants to feel better than people because that's the way that he like emotionally compensates for feeling alone and not accepted. Which is an unfortunate way to be. And so, yeah, Theon again describes of how, like, tough the Iron Islands are, or like, ooh, the islands are stern and stony places, scant of comfort and bleak of prospect. Death is never far here. So he's going like full-on grimdark. He's going like, yeah, you know, Ironborn's fucking bad, man. There's like sea gods out to get you. Gotta break rocks. It's so, you know, whoa, it's tough. And of course, Theon is so goddamn soft. Like, Theon's talking about like, oh, you know, there's no comfort on the Iron Islands. But like we later describe, you know, Theon's very, Theon demanding like a more comfortable room, and he wants his rushes changed, and he wants all his blood, and he's wearing all these nice clothes. Theon is a goddamn wallowing tub. Okay? Wallowing tub. And yes, Hixian, we are live. We did have a technical difficulty before. We missed a few minutes, but we captured all the audio for the podcast. So if you missed anything, you can go subscribe to the podcast at the top of the description. And all the audio will be there. Okay. And so Theon is an idiot, basically, is what we're trying to say. Theon thinks that he's tough, but he's really a wallowing tub. And Theon thinks the stupid girl did not seem to be listening. And then the girl asks about, like, oh, you know, can I come ashore with you? Can I, like, work in the kitchens? Can I, like, be your companion? Can I be, like, your paramour? And Theon's like, oh, this stupid girl isn't listening to my dissertation on the culture and economics of the Iron Islands. And Theon calls that stupid, which is hilarious, because why, like, it is completely, like, understandable and like strategic for the captain's daughter right now to be trying to like better her station. Like that's what she's doing now. She's saying like, hey, is there some way I can leverage this entanglement I have with this highborn idiot, and can I use this to improve my life in some way? Like, can I work in the kitchen of a highborn lord instead of being stuck on this trading ship with my father? She's like angling to try and make her life better instead of listening to Theon's like sex position about Ironborn culture, because this is classic sex position, by the way, because they start having sex, and while they're having sex, Theon is going on about like, oh, we eat salt cod and porridge on the Iron Islands, and back in the day we had salt wives and rock wives and blah 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 blah. So Theon's like doing a whole thing while he's having sex, well, specifically while the captain's daughter is blowing him, and then Theon comes just as he's describing the day he's going to be king. So it's made very clear like what is making Theon excited. Like what really turns Theon on is not the captain's daughter so much as feeling superior, feeling in charge, and thinking that he's going to be king of the world. So yeah, not a super likable guy. And by the way, we do indeed get a food description in here. We not only get the description of the salt cod and porridge that the Ironborn eat, the captain's daughter insists that she makes an excellent pepper crab stew, and therefore she should be allowed to cook in Theon's kitchen. And the pepper crab, by the way, is an extremely rare and endangered species of crab at this point. It's one of the World Wildlife Foundation's most endangered animals. But if you can get your hands on one, like sustainably sourced, of course, I would recommend eating a pepper crab, because those guys are delicious. So anyway, they're having sex and they're talking, and the captain's daughter wants to try and get a spot in Theon's household, and they have sex, and the drowned god made the Ironborn to reave and rape and to take slaves and to take them down to the Valyrian slave mines. It's interesting that, so apparently the Ironborn of old, they used to capture slaves and they used to bring them down to their mines to like mine the iron ore down in the Iron Islands, which is like the most terrible job that no one would ever want, which is like the same thing that the Valyrian Empire did back in the day. They captured slaves and they made them work under the 14 Flames. So kind of interesting similarity there. But yeah, they talk about how this old way of like Ironborn supremacy, it was ended by Aegon Targaryen, Aegon the Dragon, when he burned Harrenhal and like gave the Riverlands back to the Riverlanders, because the Ironborn used to own the Riverlands. They like conquered a big chunk of Westeros, but that's no longer the case. Yet the old red tales are still told. So they've got the Ironborn like idealize this like violent, dominant past of when the Ironborn ran everything. They got like this nationalistic, like, we're gonna reclaim our old heritage, which is obviously like a very real thing that lots of countries have. Lots of countries like have some idealized like history of like, remember when we used to rule the world and when we were the most powerful empire in the world, and they sort of want to reclaim that in some way. They wanted to bring back the old way. That's why Balon Greyjoy rebelled against Robert 10 years ago in the Greyjoy Rebellion. He wanted to make the Iron Islands great again, which, spoiler, didn't work out because Bobby B and Ned and like everyone else came down on him like a hammer. And that seems like a poor idea, doesn't it? Because like there's I mean we see it more in the Kingsmoot in Book 4, when we have like this contrast between like a new way of doing things and like the old way of doing things, and like some of the Ironborn want to like resurrect this like old history of like how they see the Ironborn, and some other people want to create like a different future for the Iron Islands. Like Yara wants to, Asher rather wants to like change things up a bit. And I dare say the whole like we do not sow thing, like it doesn't seem like a sustainable long-term way to run the country. Anyway, so Theon says, this is the season, I am the man, I will succeed, I will be king, and like that's the moment where he climaxes. So that's what gets Theon off. I think I think the thing is like it's not. It's not a crazy thing for a teenager to like dream of ruling the world, right? Like that's not an uncommon thing. Are we really criticizing a teenager here for like, liking sex and power? Like that's not exactly new, is it? I think what's really fucked up is that this feudalistic society encourages and enables those like teenage fantasies to the point where whole wars are fought for them. Like I don't think there's anything wrong with like ambition necessarily, but there's something wrong with a society where like teenage ambition leads to the deaths of thousands, which is like young Robb Stark and Tywin Lannister, like the whole sort of like that aristocratic like powerful mentality of wanting to rule the world, like that seems like such a childish thing, but it's something that is institutionalized like by the feudalistic system, right? And like in Theon we are watching like someone who is very much a kid, who's being sort of like, set up by this feudalistic system to think that it's reasonable to rule the world. And it doesn't work out for him. But like there are others for whom it does work out, like Robert Baratheon or whatever, And in the long term, that's not really good for anyone, is it? Joshua Smith in the chat says that I would imagine the amount of calories burned stealing and raiding all your food would wind up being a deficit. Yeah, well that's a good point, Joshua. And to clarify, like, I don't think the Ironborn are, like, straight up using Westeros as a pantry. Like, they're not, like, sailing to Westeros and stealing a granary every time they need some Weetabix. What they do is they capture, like, slaves in Westeros, and then they take them back to the Iron Islands, and they do force their slaves and stuff to farm on the Iron Islands. And farming is really shitty on the Iron Islands because the land is crap and it's cold and it's blah blah blah. So they force like slaves to scratch at the land, or they used to. And now I think it's mostly just like poor Ironborn who have to farm on the Iron Islands. But like also, they captured the fertile Riverlands not so long ago, and so they were using like the harvest of the Riverlanders to eat off and so on. So like, yeah, that's how they get food. Okay, so. They have sex, and Theon thinks about how, the sea means so much to him because he's a real Ironborn, and the sea means freedom and blah, blah, blah. The beating of the waves is as familiar as the beating of his own heart. I had forgotten that, he thinks, but I must remember. So it's like Theon is telling himself that he's a real Ironborn and like he knows the beating of the ocean as well as his own heartbeat. Like he's telling himself that he's got some like deep connection to Ironborn culture, but I think he's kidding himself. Like he's just telling himself that because he wants to believe that he is like part of the Ironborn family and part of like he'll get Ironborn power when that's not really the case. Yeah, as Shiera in the chat says, this is the first time that Theon is able to feel any kind of power, and it's not any real power. It's just fantasizing. Yeah, that's what this is. So someone in the chat says, Alt Shift, if you know so much about Game of Thrones, why don't you name one book? I can't think of any. You got me there, Julia. I can't read the thing. Anyway, so the captain's daughter begs Theon, take me with you, my lord. I'll like, I don't even need to work in the kitchen. Just take me to like the nearby town, and I can be your salt wife. And like, she's like, I don't know to what extent, like, maybe the captain's daughter is like legitimately like feeling like emotionally invested in Theon. She feels like Theon is like her best hope of like having a decent life. I don't know if the captain's daughter really believes that Theon cares about her, because he's being like obviously pretty like cold. Maybe to some extent she actually like feels some like misplaced affection for him, or maybe it's more of a strategic thing and she wants to like improve her station. It's not super clear like what the captain's daughter is thinking at this point. We also don't know how old she is. Like I think Theon mentions that like, he was surprised that she was a virgin based on her age, so she can't be too young, I suppose. But the captain's daughter is begging Theon to like take her back to Pike with him. And Theon is saying, nah, my place is Pike and yours is on this ship. And then the captain's daughter's like, but like, you're really screwing me over here because my father, the captain, he's going to punish me. He's going to call me names and hit me. So the captain's a cunt, and he is going to treat his daughter badly because she had sex with Theon, even though she had no choice in the matter. Probably. I mean, like, Theon does say that, like, the captain's daughter came willingly because, you know, he just whispered some nice words and gave her wine, which is all very, like, Theon is sort of flattering himself there. But, like, the captain's daughter would probably have had to have submitted to Theon's desire whether she wanted to or not, because that's the kind of society that they're living in. So, like, Theon's flattering himself by saying that, oh, you know, she came willingly, I think. And now the captain's daughter is in this terrible position of the captain, her father is going to treat her badly, she thinks, because of this. So she's between a rock and a hard place, and she's saying, please take me to the islands, because that's, like, my best hope of, like, an actually decent life. But Theon's like, no. Theon's totally cold, totally unsympathetic. He just says that, well, you know, with a number of times I've fucked you, you're probably going to have a kid. And, you know, it's a big honor to have a king's bastard. Your father should be glad, because he'll get to raise a king's bastard. So Theon's being incredibly, like, cruel and cold here. And he leaves her on the ship. And I think the irony here is that, like, Theon is saying, like, oh, you're going to be rejected by your father, you're going to be rejected by your home, well, I don't care. And the irony is that Theon is about to be rejected by his father, Balon, and he's about to be rejected by his homeland. So, like, I think this is a deliberate, like, parallel, where, like, Theon has put the captain's daughter in a position of being rejected by her family and home, and now Theon is about to feel what that's like. So Theon is getting his comeuppance within this very chapter, I think. He's about to be rejected just like the captain's daughter is. So they approach this town of Lordsport, which is this other Iron Islands town, and they notice that, like, back in the day, this whole area was, like, destroyed by Robert Baratheon in the Greyjoy Rebellion. But most of it's been rebuilt. Like, this used to be a smoking wasteland, but now few traces of the war remain. And they've built a new castle, a new inn. Like, the old inn was destroyed, and now the new inn is twice the size of the old one. So I think this is a nice, like, Ironborn-y thing, because they got destroyed, they got beaten down in the Greyjoy Rebellion, but then they rose again harder and stronger. That's what happened. Like, that's what happens with the Ironborn. They get beaten down, but they always get back up again. And that's what they did symbolically and architecturally after the Greyjoy Rebellion. There used to be a sept here, like a temple of the Faith of the Seven, but it got destroyed during Robert's Rebellion, and they never rebuilt the sept. So Robert Baratheon's fury soured the Ironborn's taste for the new gods, it would seem. And they noticed some, like, traders and stuff hanging out of the Iron Islands, including an Ibonese cog. And you'll know that, like, the Ibonese are, like, Neanderthals, right? Like, the Ibonese are, like, they seem to be, like, a separate, like, subspecies of human, like, because they can't reproduce with ordinary humans, and, like, their whole bodies are, like very different. They're, like, squat and hairy and stuff. So, like, I think they're cavemen, which is kind of wild. And Theon notices that there's, like, 50 or 60 big long ships parked outside Lordsport. And he's a bit sort of unsettled by that. Like, he's thinking, like, oh, so does this mean that my father Balon has, like, gathered all of the banners? Like, he's gathered the banners and he's gonna, like, start a war or something? Like, what is Balon planning? Why is he gathering all his ships? Shiera says, do we see that cog later on in the chat? We do see several Ibonese cogs. I don't know if it's the same one. I suspect there's more than one, but I don't know, maybe it's the same. It would be funny if we could, like, piece together, like, this little sub-narrative of, like, Ibonese traders just, like, hanging out. Like, maybe you can connect all the places that we see them, and maybe there's some kind of narrative happening. Anyway, so Theon's a bit unsettled that, like, all the ships have been called, because Theon thinks again, this is Theon's hour, this is my plan, my glory, my crown. He's really sucking his own dick here. And so he's a bit disturbed that Balon might be trying to make a play on his own. But Theon thinks, nah, like, you know, he's probably just being cautious. I don't think Balon's trying to start a war, because old men are cautious by nature. And that's a hilarious misreading of Balon Greyjoy, because Balon is not a cautious man, I wouldn't say. If he was cautious, he would probably live a lot longer than he does. Well, then again, he does sort of win the War of the Five Kings because, Renly dies and Stannis dies and everyone dies before him. So, maybe... Well, no, Stannis survives. Anyway, so they land at Lordsport, and Theon's thinking, who's gonna welcome me when I come back home? Is there gonna be an honor guard? Am I gonna see Dagmar Cleftjaw? Is my father gonna be here? Is my mother gonna be here? Like, what kind of party are they throwing for my arrival? And as it turns out, there is no party. There's no streamers. There's just a bunch of fisher folk standing around, and there's some priest walking around with some horses, and there's a slattern leaning out of a window, and there's some Ibonese sailors. Apparently no one has come to greet him. So Theon is a bit deflated and disappointed that there's no homecoming party. And no one seems to recognize who Theon is. He's the Prince of the Iron Islands. He's the heir to Pike. He's expecting a whole lot of attention and adoration. None of it comes. And so they do not know who he is, Theon thinks. And so his response to this disappointment is to start barking at people. Without waiting for a reply, he says, "Innkeep, I require a horse." So we sort of see in a very direct way how Theon's rudeness and obnoxiousness is a very direct reaction to his feelings of disappointment and not having attention. He had forgotten how bold the Ironborn could be. He over and over in this chapter, it uses this motif of forgetting and remembering. He's always remembering things and talking about the things he forgot, which I think connects to the sort of meme in A Dance with Dragons when Theon keeps thinking, you have to remember your name. Your name is Reek. So it's memory is tied to identity in Theon's arc. He's always trying to remember who he is. In this case, he's trying to remember being an Ironborn, but that doesn't exactly work out, does it? So he gets off the ship and he gets a guy to carry his bags to Pike, and then this priest turns up. And this priest arrives, and all the small folk bend the knee, and they murmur damp hair. And Theon finds out that this priest guy is his uncle Aeron. Which is not how he remembered Aeron. Aeron used to be this drinker and someone who laughed and he loved ale and women. But Aeron, some time back, he drowned and then he got reborn from the sea and he became a drowned priest. So this is not the homecoming Theon was wanting. But this is the person who's going to take him to Pike. And yeah, in the TV show, it is Asher pretending to be some woman called Esgred in the show. But in the books, it's just Aeron who takes Theon to Pike. And then we get the Asher Esgred thing later on. That happens later. So anyway, so we get this description of Aeron Damphair, and Aeron is tall and thin with fierce black eyes, and his mottled robes are green and grey and blue, the swirling colours of the drowned god, and there's dried seaweed braided through his hair, which all sounds very lovely, but can you imagine what that would smell like? Seaweed is pretty rank at the best of times. How often do you think Aeron changes his seaweed? How often do you think he's shampooing his locks, which by the way go down to the small of his back? I would not want to smell Aeron Damphair, is all I'm saying. And so Theon has more memories of what Aeron used to be like, and Aeron is very sort of curt and just says that nephew Theon, your father told me to take you to Pike. Come along. So there's no oh, my dear Theon, it's so good to see you again. It's been 10 years. It's just, yep, get over here, kiddo. We're taking you to the castle. That's all it is. No warmth. None of the affection that Theon wants. Just business. It's all business. Okay, so the captain's daughter has another go at saying, "Oh, Theon, please, my lord, take me to Pike, please." But Theon steps aside and says, "No, see ya." So he's cruel and cold with this captain's daughter, just like Damphair is cruel and cold with him. I think this is a very deliberate thing that George Martin is doing. Theon is treating the captain's daughter badly, just as Theon's own family is treating him badly. It's this, generational dysfunction thing that's happening. Theon Theon feels that he's been mistreated, and so he mistreats others, and that's how, like, bad behavior gets, like, passed down, right? So he goes off towards Pike with Aeron, and Theon's like, oh, I was really hoping that there'd be, you know, a party, like, at least some cake, but Aeron's like, it is not for you to question the demands of the Lord Reaper of Pike. So, you know, Aeron is, like, super, like, just cold and, like, all business and no bullshit, and Theon's like, well, alright, so why are all these ships here? And Aeron's like, why are longships ever hosted? So Aeron keeps, like, answering questions with questions and just being, like, this annoying fucking priest. He just answers everything with, like, some, like, priestly platitude. And all Aeron wants to know from Theon is, like, do you pray to the wolf gods now? Like, are you a Stark now? Are you a little wolfling? Or are you a real Ironborn? That's what Aeron wants to know. And spoiler, Theon does not convince Aeron that he's a true blue Ironborn. Theon thinks that he seldom prays at all. He's not really religious, but that's not something you confess to a priest. So he's like, oh, no, I'm Ironborn, sure. Drowned God, yeah, I know him. And so Aeron says, kneel. Or are you too proud now, a lordling of the Green Lands? So Theon tries to convince Aeron that, like, yeah, he's true blue dinky die Ironborn, and Theon figures that a crown is worth a little mud and horse shit, and so he kneels in the mud, and Aeron pours the flask full of salt water over his head, and he blesses him with salt and stone and steel. And Theon, who was, like, literally just saying, like, oh, you know, my heart beats with the beating of the waves, and oh, the sea means freedom, and I'm a tough, hard Ironborn. But when the seawater is poured over his head, it's all he can do not to cry out. The salt water makes his eyes burn, and he shivers when it goes down his back, like a little splash of salt water. And Theon's like, oh, it's too much for me, when he was just saying, I'm such a hard, salty Ironborn. So, yeah, it's ridiculous. And Theon says, what is dead may never die, Theon said, remembering. So they keep on, like, hammering this, like, remembrance theme. So Theon's like, all right, good. I've been christened. Great. What's news on the Iron Islands? And Aeron says, men fish the sea, dig in the earth, and die. Women birth children in blood and pain, and die. Night follows day. The wind and tides remain. So he's like super, like, hard-ass, like, apocalypto grimdark priest. And Theon's just trying to say, like, hey, like, what's news, Unky? Like, what happened while I was gone? What did I miss, pal? And Aeron's just like, oh, our islands are as our god made them. You know, so, like, he's not a great conversationalist. And he's not the sort of, like, welcoming uncle that you want. Especially when this was, like, the fun uncle. Like Balon was always a hard-ass. Euron was crazy. Victarion's just like a warrior guy. Aeron seems like he was sort of the closest to Theon's personality, because Aeron liked drinking and partying and women. So like imagine if Theon got to come home and, like, Aeron was still the way he used to be. But that's not what he gets. He gets this hard-ass priest. He learns that his mother is living on Harlaw because she's a bit sick, and Balon is on Pike, so they go on a Pike. And Theon notes that Black Wind is the name of his sister Ash's ship, and Grey Wind is the name of Robb Stark's wolf. And so Theon says, Stark is grey, and Greyjoy's black, but it seems we're both windy. Which I find just so fun, as just such a wonderfully, like, absurd and, like out of tone line. And the priest has nothing to say to that. And I guess that's just another way of highlighting the difference and the distance between Theon and Dampere, and between Theon and his Ironborn, you know, culture. Like, Theon calls himself an Ironborn, but he's really just like this impetuous teenager who's been living in the north. Like, he's not an Ironborn. And Dampere describes the way he's changed. Like, Dampere acknowledges that he used to be young and vain, but he says that the sea washed my follies and my vanities away. That man drowned, and now he's a new man. And Theon thinks, oh, this guy's mad. My uncle's gone mad. But it's funny because that is kind of what happens to Theon later on. Like, Theon at the moment is young and vain, but soon his follies and his vanities will be washed away, just like Damper's was. Because, like, when Theon gets captured by Ramsay, his personality is similarly, you know, rebuilt. He becomes a different person. A much more broken, terrible, vulnerable, awful person. But he does change, like Damper does. But Theon is not capable of understanding that kind of change as yet. And so Damper refuses to like discuss details of like the ships and the war with Theon, and Theon gets really mad. He feels like he's being treated like a child. And he like brags about like, oh, you know, I've led men in war, I've hunted with a king, I've fought in the Whispering Wood with Rob, I've bedded more girls than I can name, you know, as though, like, Damper would be impressed that Theon's, like, slept with a couple of, like, Winterfell slatterns, quote-unquote. I am heir to Pike and the Iron Islands. And Aeron just says, we shall see. And that really kind of scares Theon, because it becomes apparent that, like, Asher, Theon's older sister, is being considered as a potential heir to Pike ahead of Theon. And Theon is, like, outraged by that, because Theon's like, well, I'm the eldest male heir, I should rightfully be the king, but Aeron's like, maybe Asher will instead be the ruler. Like, your legacy's not secure. And that threatens everything that Theon came here for. Theon desperately wants the crown. Theon desperately wants acknowledgement and power and status. And if his sister takes that ahead of him, Theon would be, and will be, very, very bloody upset. Thank you very much, Angela Smith, for the super chat. So Aeron said, and so Theon says, I will not be cheated of my rights, I warn you. And Damper is not impressed. Damper says, you warn a servant of the drowned god, boy? You have forgotten more than you know, and you're a great fool if you believe Balon Greyjoy will hand these holy islands over to a Stark. Now be silent. The ride is long enough without your magpie chatterings. Which is so great. Like, I love that, you know, it reinforces the forgetfulness and remembering theme with Theon, and it also, like, accuses Theon of magpie chatterings, which is a great, like, callback to the captain's daughter, and how Theon accused the captain's daughter of dumb prattling. You know, now Theon is the dumb prattler. You know, the boot is on the other foot. It's exactly that situation of, like, you know, Theon treats people bad, and now he gets treated bad, and it's this whole sort of just vicious cycle of just people being terrible to each other that Theon is trapped in. And Theon thinks, oh, you know, Aeron calls me a Stark, as if 10 years in Winterfell could make me a Stark. And, like, he says that, you know, derisively, but it's also like this bitter thing of, you know, Theon wishes that the last 10 years in Winterfell made him a Stark. That's Theon's whole problem. Like his problem is that, you know, he's trying to be an Ironborn because he feels rejected by the Starks, but he gets rejected by the Ironborn because they think he's a Stark, you know? So he just gets totally, like, stuck in between these two families, neither of which will accept him, and that's really the crux of all of Theon's pain. And Theon thinks about how he's never been one of them. Ned did raise Theon among his own children, but Theon had never felt accepted. Even the bastard Jon Snow had been accorded more honor than he had. And Jon was always sullen, and, like, they never got along. And I always think it's so sad that, like, Theon and Jon didn't get along, because they are in very similar situations. They have very similar feelings. Like, they both feel like they're out of place and they're rejected, and they're in, like, this similar sort of, like, limbo of, like, not quite being accepted. So, like, you would have think that they could have gotten along, but alas. Schubert in the chat asks, who is Theon's mum? Does she make any appearances? So she's chilling on what island? I just said Harlaw, and she's sick, and we do have a scene of Asher visiting her mum on Harlaw, I believe. I don't think Theon meets her. What's her name again? Yeah, I forget what Theon's mum's name is. Someone say in the chat. But yeah, I believe we do see her in an Asher chapter. So Theon thinks about, oh, you know, oh, I never really had a father in Winterfell because Ned, I was mostly just scared of Ned. And, Catelyn was just, yeah, Alanis. I think that might be it. Alanis with a Y, I think, Shiera. And no one treated me well in Winterfell, and Catelyn was really distant and suspicious. And he sort of criticizes all the other people around him. Like, he thinks that the younger Stark children, they were too young to be worth his notice, and Jon was sullen, and Robb Theon is friends with. Theon says that he has a certain affection for Robb, as for a younger brother. But he doesn't really feel connected to any of the Starks. I think Theon and Robb are closer friends in the TV show than they are in the books. Because it is a very sort of non-committal. Theon has a certain affection for Robb as for a younger brother. Because I think Theon is 3 or 4 years older than Robb in the books, so I guess there's a bit more distance there. But, I just think, it's such a shame that Theon is, so sort of, critical and distant from everyone in Winterfell. And you can compare that to someone like Arya. Because, Arya Stark is someone who also feels very sort of, disconnected from, people. She also feels like an outsider. But Arya is really good at making friends with lots of different kinds of people, like Micah, she hangs out with lots of common people, and she connects with lots of different people. And I guess Theon does have a bit of that. Theon does, they often describe Theon talking and joking with the soldiers and the guards and stuff. But I don't know if any of those if he makes many lasting connections there. Whereas Arya's quite good at hanging out with lots of different kinds of people. And so blah blah blah, and so we have more talk of forgetting and forgiving and memory. I think George R. R. Martin as a writer is really obsessed with memory. He's always going on about songs are often a sort of metaphor for memory, and dreams, and very often his characters are constantly reminiscing about some other pastime or some lost love, or even just thematically and magically, there's some old magical time that's slowly being lost. George Martin's all about memory. And so Theon thinks about the journey to Pike, and he hung out with Patrick Mallister, who was sort of a mate, but they didn't get to hang out with the Mallisters for long, because the Mallisters are not big fans of Ironborn, because the Mallisters live at Seaguard, and the reason why Seaguard is called Seaguard is because it's a defense against Ironborn, who are constantly attacking the Westerosi coast. So Theon was trying to make friends with this Patrick Mallister guy, but the Mallisters have this very old grudge against the Ironborn, who used to constantly attack their city. So that created this distance. Theon is alienated because of his culture. He also happens to be pretty obnoxious, but he's also alienated for some reasons that are outside of his control. And they talk about how Theon's brother Roderick was killed at Seaguard when Roderick Greyjoy attacked Seaguard back in the Greyjoy Rebellion, I suppose. And still riding with damp hair, Aeron is not talking much, and they ride in a gloom of silence. And Theon tries to converse, but Aeron just answers all of his questions with just these stupid priestly platitudes. Theon's oh, Robb, so Robb is Lord of Winterfell now. What do you think about that? And Aeron just says, one wolf is much like the other. And then, Theon's well, but, there's new opportunities now because of the war with the Starks and stuff. It means a new day, uncle. And Aeron says, every morning brings a new day, much like the old. So, Aeron is just not budging. He's not giving Theon anything. Emily in the chat says that she finds Theon's resilience inspiring, and yeah, Theon, if nothing else, is extremely resilient. The fact that he's alive after all the shit that he goes through, in Dance is impressive. And I think that is part of what's interesting about Theon. It would have been easy to write a story about a character who is totally likable and totally relatable and totally a good guy, who then suffers and then becomes this resilient figure. But the fact that we start with a character who's quite dislikable, and then through his suffering we come to care about him, I think that's a more interesting sort of way to approach it, perhaps, as a character. And Dampere claims that the comet is a sign from the drowned god that we're going to go forth and attack Westeros again. So, like, once again, everyone's going on about taking over shit. And yeah, and Theon says, I could not agree more, and Dampere says, a man agrees with God as a raindrop with the storm. So he's, like, being very, like, godly, but he's also saying your opinion don't mean shit. And Theon's like, ooh, this raindrop will be a king one day, old man. So Theon is still, like, totally sticking to his guns. He thinks he's going to be top shit, but it's not going to work out. And he talks about, you know, the Greyjoy Rebellion and the war and his resentment for Robert Baratheon. And, you know, Theon comes home at last to Pike, but all the common people look at him with strangers' arms. And there are some slaves staring at him with dull eyes. And there's dogs and some kids running around. But Theon thinks that it's a bleak and bitter homecoming. Which is basically like you could use that line to sum up this entire chapter. It's a bleak and bitter homecoming. And so Aeron drops him off at Pike and he's like, all right, I'm fucking off now. And Theon's like, what? You're not going to, like, come and have a family dinner now that the nephew's home? And the uncle's just like, nah, you know, I was told to bring you and I brought you. Now I return to our god's business. You know, he's probably got some seaweed to braid into his hair. And so then a common woman, a servant, comes and takes Theon to a room. And so Theon's like, oh, so you do know who I am. It is the lamest thing in the world. Like, the most obnoxious sentence in the English language is, do you know who I am? Like, for so many reasons. Like because, you know, it's incredibly obnoxious. But also, if you have to say that, if you have to say, do you know who I am, you've already lost. Like, they already don't. There's no win condition from saying, do you know who I am? But yeah, that's what Theon does. And he feels like everyone's treated him coldly. And he asks about some of the people he used to know. He asks about Maester Quaylen, and he asks about Silas the Steward, and both of them are dead. So, like, this place has changed since he's been here last. It's as if I were a stranger. And this is not how he imagined his homecoming. And he's taken to a chilly room in the bloody keep where some Riverlord sons were once slaughtered, which is not like a great omen. Like, he's living in like a murder hotel is basically what's happening. Like, he's staying in a room where people used to be killed. But he does not fear ghosts. He mentions it's mostly just the discomfort of the room because it's full of mildew and it's musty and it's damp. And I think it's interesting that Theon mentions fear of ghosts because Theon later in A Dance with Dragons becomes the ghost of Winterfell, right? So I think that might be a little bit of subtle foreshadowing of what Theon is going to become. And so Theon's like, oh, this room's so uncomfortable. Like, bring me some hot water, bring a fire, like, change these rushes. You know, just after Theon was saying that, oh, you know, there's no comfort on the Iron Islands. This is for hard men. But, like, he clearly is not that hard. And then he dresses up in his finest clothes in soft lambswool breeches and a gold chain and supple black leather. All these comfortable, pretty clothes. And gloves, silk gloves decorated with delicate scrollwork tracery. Like, this is so not Ironborn. And he crosses the, like, terrifying rope bridge to go to the sea tower where his father Balon is staying, and he curses when a splinter snags the fabric of his silk glove. Like, Theon is so out of place here. And he barges through into his father's room, and he sees his dad for the first time in 10 years. And Balon looks gaunt and shrunken and old. He's bone thin and bone hard. Like, this is a real Ironborn, this guy. And yeah, Balon's hair goes down to the small of his back. And I also, like, Balon cannot smell good. He's wearing, like, a seal leather thing over his whole body. And Balon just says, like, Balon doesn't say hello. He doesn't say, oh, my dear boy, like, let's hang out. He says, 9 years, is it? A boy they took. What are you now? And Theon says, I'm a man. I'm your blood and your heir. And Balon grunts and says, we shall see. Theon's been gone for 10 years, and so Balon comments that Stark had you as long as I, and now you come as his envoy. And Balon reflects that Ned Stark and Robert Baratheon were the ones who came and broke Balon's castle. And Balon said he vowed that he would live to see them both in their graves, and he has. So, like, winner, winner, chicken dinner. Like, Balon has outlived the people who attacked him. And indeed, Balon outlives most of the Five Kings in the War of the Five Kings. So Balon does kind of outlast and outsurvive a lot of others, because that's what Ironborn do. They get beaten down, but they survive. At least for a while. And so Balon looks on all of Theon's velvets and silks and says, "Did it please Ned Stark to dress you up and make you his own sweet daughter?" Because, of course, all these fine clothes are not the Ironborn way. And Balon asks about Theon's jewelry and says, was it paid for with gold or iron? Because the Ironborn are meant to they're meant to pay the iron price to get that sort of thing. They're meant to take it off the corpses of enemies that they slew. But Theon bought it. So Balon is constantly criticizing Theon and saying, "Ooh, you blush red as a maid. You're dressing yourself like a whore." It's always nice when a father, attacks their son's masculinity like that. Call him a fucking fag. Like, that's basically what Balon is doing to Theon right now. Saying, you ain't shit, you're not a real man, you're just dressed up as this pretty southern Greenlander, and he doesn't approve of the person Theon seems to have become. The Greenlands have made you soft. The Starks have made you theirs. And it's funny because, again, what Theon wanted was to be a Stark, but he felt like he wasn't made a Stark, and that's why he's here trying to be an Ironborn, but the Ironborn won't accept him, so he's stuck between a rock and a hard place. And Theon says, "You're wrong. Ned Stark was my jailer, but my blood is salt and iron," which is just so not true. He's not a tough, hard Ironborn. And so Theon delivers this letter that Robb wrote that says that the Iron Islands can be their own independent kingdom if they ally with the Starks. But Balon rabbits on more about Theon's brothers, Roderick and Maren, who were killed, and he criticizes his relationship with Robb Stark. And Theon's like, nah, Roderick and Maren are my real brothers. But internally, he's just remembering Roderick and Maren's drunken cuffs and cruel japes. So it seems like Theon's brothers were assholes, but he sort of pretends that they are his real family. And Theon's like, this plan is going to be great. This offer that Robb Stark has made, it's going to be amazing. We're going to be an independent kingdom. We can attack the Lannisters. We'll help the Starks attack the Lannisters. And then the Starks will let us have the Lannister lands. And so Theon's saying that I'll lead the attack. I'll go, lead the Ironborn fleets to attack the Westerlands. And what I ask is that I want Casterly Rock. He's saying that I'm going to be the king of the Ironborn. I'm going to live at Casterly Rock, the biggest and richest of the castles in Westeros, just about. And it's going to be great. But Balon does not agree with this plan. Because he doesn't want someone to give him a crown. He doesn't want to receive a crown from a Starkling king. He wants to take a crown because he's Ironborn and they take what's theirs. They pay the iron price. And Theon's like, are you crazy? What are you suggesting? And Balon hits his son across the cheek and says, mind your tongue. I am the Lord Reaper of Pike. I am king of Salt and Rock. I will take my crown as Euron Redhand did 5,000 years ago. Idealized past, make the Iron Islands great again. We will carve out a kingdom with fire and sword. And Theon's like, what are you talking about? What are you saying? And Balon's like, we're not going to attack the Westlands. We're not going to attack the Lannisters. We're going to attack ... the North. So that's a big alteration to Theon's plans. He was trying to go to the Greyjoys instead of the Starks, but he was not at this point planning to betray the Starks. He was going to ally with his friend Robb Stark, and he was going to take Casterly Rock, the one of the richest and most comfortable and powerful castles in Westeros, and he was going to win the approval of his father, and he was going to be king, and he was going to have all the party times he ever wanted, and everything was going to be great. But things are not going that way. Theon is now being forced to choose. He can't have his cake and eat it too. He can't ally with Robb and attack and be part of the Ironborn. He has to choose between one or the other. Does he betray Robb and attack the North, or does he reject his family, the Greyjoys, and return to the North? And spoiler, he chooses the Greyjoys, and spoiler, it does not end well. Alright, so that was the first ever Theon chapter. Thank you so much for listening. We got a lot more insight into who Theon is as a person. Up till now, we haven't known much about what's going on in his head, but I think we got a much better understanding of like what all his resentments are, and how he feels estranged from his two families, and how all of his sort of obnoxiousness and rudeness and unpleasantness, you know, his desire to feel superior, I think all of that is to compensate for feeling like he's not part of a family and he ain't shit, and so that's why he does what he does. And now he's entering this period where he's about to make this pivotal decision between Squids and Starks, between Greyjoys and the North, and it's all downhill from here. All right, so thank you for participating. There was a hiccup in the live stream, so if you missed stuff, we're going to upload the full audio track to the podcast. Click the link at the top of the video description on YouTube to subscribe to the podcast. I think it is a much better way to listen as an audio feed on the podcast instead of on YouTube, so do subscribe. And again, we might rename the podcast. We might change it from ACOK Abridged to just Game of Thrones Abridged, because people actually know what that means. So that means we'll continue the numbering from the first book. We also might upload like the 80 episodes of like book 1 onto the podcast feed. So if anything weird happens to the podcast feed, that'll be why. But anyway, thank you all. Thank you to everyone in the chat. Thank you, Emily, Alex, Brinks, Schubert, Number 9, Rebel Girl, Shiera, and everyone else. And we'll do another episode in the future. Cheers. Have a good one. Bye-bye.